Right now in Australia, there is a man named Phil Gore who is attempting something that has never been done before. So if you were to Google Project 168, you would see something like what we're going to put on the screen. This is in Forestdale, Australia. And the project is called Project 168. And so the 168 comes from 168 hours from last Sunday to this coming Sunday. And Phil Gore is running for 168 hours. 7 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's a lap that he's running. So every hour he runs a lap. It is 6.71 kilometers, which is a little bit over 4 miles. And to run that in an hour would be 15 minutes an hour. So you'd run 4 miles an hour. And you can chart his average pace, so you can see that his fastest pace was 37 minutes, and his slowest pace was 55 minutes. Here's what happens when he's running. When he finishes that lap, let's say he started, by the way, he is on lap 96 right now. Let's say he started at 6 o'clock our time. And let's say he ran a particularly fast race, or lap, which he didn't, but let's say he ran a particularly fast lap, and he finished that lap in 35 minutes. That means he has 25 minutes to stop, rest, change clothes, eat, take a nap, until 7 o'clock when the next lap starts. And here's the rules. You have to start every new lap on the new hour. Okay, 168 times. So you can chart where he is, and you can see the graph is showing his pace for every lap that he's run. And so when he stops, let's say he ran one lap at 37 minutes, that meant he had 23 minutes until the next lap. But look over there at that red one, that lap he completed in 55 minutes, which meant he had 4 minutes and 20 seconds to rest before the next lap started. So I thought, maybe he could just take a little break at the end of one and a break at the beginning of another. So he could do like a 20-minute break, but it doesn't work that way. He has to start at the top of the hour or is disqualified 168 times. So every lap's the same. Doesn't change day or night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Every lap's the same 168 times. So every hill, every obstacle is the same every time. The scenery doesn't change 168 times. 168 laps, 168 decisions. So at the top of every hour, he's got to decide, am I going to go one more lap? 4 miles. So he's not starting, let's say last Sunday when he started, his goal was not to, I'm going to run 7 days, I'm going to run one lap. And when I finish that lap, I'm going to make another decision, and I'm going to run another lap, and now he's on whatever he is, 96, and he's got however many left before he gets to 168. So I had questions, okay? We're talking about from Simon to Peter now. I had questions about Phil Gore. My first question, as you could probably imagine, is why would someone do that? He would say, number one, because it hadn't been done before. Number two, he's raising money for underprivileged children there in Australia. And so I'm sure there's a particular reason in his mind in those many laps that he's making. So then I thought, okay, does he stop at the end of each lap? Yes, he stops. Does he take a nap? Yes, he takes a nap, depending on how much time he has. And so he's on lap 96. Should be coming to the end of lap 96 right about now. And he's got a little bit of break before the next one that'll start at 7 o'clock, and he'll start number 97. 168 times. So I thought about that as I was getting ready for our lesson tonight. We're studying through the life of Peter. We're talking about Peter's journey from Simon to Peter and what God's doing in his life, what God is teaching him, and the progress that Peter made. And it was kind of like that graph that you saw, kind of peaks and valleys, went up and down like that, and probably not a whole lot different than the graph of most of our lives, where there'd be peaks where we were particularly faithful to the Lord, and then there might be valleys where we were, let's say, less faithful to the Lord. And fortunately for us, there's not somebody going around writing a gospel story about our lives, okay? But that's the picture of Peter's life, and we know a lot about Peter's life, and we know a lot about the peaks, we know a lot about the valleys, and today we're going to look at one more step, and I'm using that word on purpose, from Matthew chapter 14. So take your Bible, turn to Matthew 14, and we are going to look at a story that is probably familiar to you, but I want to look at it from the context of what God is doing in the life of Peter. Matthew 14, beginning in verse 22. So just glance across the page at the early part of chapter 14, and you will note the immediate context. Jesus just fed the 5,000. All right? Now get to verse 22. Immediately after that, he compelled the disciples to get into a boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And after he sent the multitudes away, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from the shore, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. It's about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost." They cried out in fear, but immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter responded and said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and when he began to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are truly the Son of God." Now, what I want to suggest to you tonight is the passage is about more than just Peter walking on the water. It is about that, but it's not only about that, so that the fact that Peter stepped out of the boat, took his eyes off Jesus, and began to sink is still only part of the story. There's more, so let's look. I want to look at this passage, and we'll start a little bit about the context. Remember, at this point, Peter is a disciple of Jesus. He has been called, commissioned, set aside, and he said yes. A couple of weeks ago, in our study of the early chapters of the Gospel of Mark, we filled in some of the content of what happened between our study from last week and our study tonight. That was Jesus' ministry in Capernaum. And you remember where Jesus went to the synagogue, and then he went to Peter's house, and then the crowds were there, and Jesus left to be alone, and then Jesus came back. Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law, and all of that took place between last week and this week. And so now, by this point, Jesus has chosen his 12 disciples. He has miraculously fed the 5,000. Earlier in Matthew 14, John the Baptist has been arrested and executed. And all of that is some measure of context before what we have here in Matthew 14. These disciples, to their credit, left everything to follow Jesus. Matthew left the tax office. Peter and Andrew, James and John left the fishing business, and everybody else left whatever else they were doing to follow Jesus. They are now, for the rest of Jesus' ministry, 3.5 years of his earthly ministry, they are now solely following Jesus. They're seen everywhere Jesus was, except when Jesus was alone with the Father. So for the next 3.5 years, they're there. They're following Jesus. They're going where Jesus went. Peter in Matthew 19 said, Lord, we've left everything to follow you. And they did. They left family. They left business. They left whatever else they had been doing with their lives to pursue this ministry of following Jesus. And now, in the context, Jesus has just fed the 5,000. And John's gospel in John 6 tells us a little bit more context. John 6:14 and 15, John says, right after Jesus fed the 5,000, the people tried to make him king by force. So they're going to forcibly make Jesus king. Why? Because he can do things. He can heal sick. He can feed 5,000 people with just a few loaves of fish and bread. And so they were going to make him king. So now all of that is fitting into place. So the people are there and they're shouting praise about Jesus. And I like what Erwin Lutzer said. Jesus was not seduced by their praise. They want to make Jesus king, but that's not on Jesus' agenda. He did not come to be their earthly king. He came to be their Savior. And so Jesus responds by leaving to go be alone with the Father. Right before he did that, he sent the disciples away. You guys go get in the boat, go across to the other side of the sea. I'll meet you over there. He dispatches the crowds, sends them away, goes up on the mountain to pray. Now look at the beginning of verse 22, and you're going to see this word 3 times in the passage that I just read. Immediately. Now we're familiar with that word already because we saw it 11 times in the first 3 chapters of Mark, where Mark loved to talk about Jesus did this immediately. Matthew picks up on that thought here 3 times. But it's on purpose here. That's not a word that Matthew uses as frequently as Mark. So why is Matthew highlighting that? Well, this is subsequent to everything that just happened. So Jesus fed the 5,000. He sent the crowds away immediately. Okay, he, notice, compelled the disciples. Okay, so Jesus has not asked the disciples, would you like to go for a boat ride? Okay, he has compelled them. So Jesus compelled them to go out on a boat ride, and apparently Jesus spent a considerable amount of time praying. So we don't know the exact amount of time, but when you get to the verse 25, note what time Jesus met them on the sea. It's the 4th watch of the night. The 4th watch is between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Okay, so whatever time it was when Jesus dispatched the multitude. Now, we know it was late in the day because the disciples came to Jesus and they said, you need to send the people away. It's late in the day. They're hungry. They don't have anything to eat. They've been here all day. And Jesus said, well, you give them something to eat. Well, we don't have anything. What do you have? Okay, and so from that context, it's later in the day. So mid to late afternoon, maybe early evening, Jesus dispatches the multitudes, sends the disciples out on the boat. What time was that? 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever time that is. That's when Jesus sent them out. He sends the crowds away, goes up on a mountain to pray. So even if it's 9 o'clock, Jesus has been praying from 9 o'clock till now 4:30. And it's 4th watch of the night when Jesus met the disciples in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. But what have the disciples been doing that whole time? They've been rowing a boat. Now, we learn that it's about where they are. John says it's about 4 miles from shore. Okay? For context, from one end to the Sea of Galilee to the other is 8 miles. Okay? So in the, let's say, from 9 o'clock in the evening to 4:30 in the morning, they've made it 4 miles. But it's not just 4 miles of rowing a boat, it's 4 miles of rowing a boat against the storm. And you begin to think about what's going on here. Jesus has a purpose that the disciples don't yet understand. He has now intentionally sent them out into the sea knowing there's a storm. Now, process this in your theology of why bad things happen to good people, and this is all going to be, again, to fit into context, okay? Jesus has intentionally sent them out into the storm. It's not that Jesus came out, oh, there's a storm, I should go help them. He sent them out knowing the storm was coming. So whatever you think about what the Lord does in the difficult times of your life, just process this, that he sent them out there on purpose. Apparently, there was something that the disciples needed to learn that they could learn better in the storm than they could learn in the calm. So Jesus sent them out into the storm. Now, the Sea of Galilee, for context, is 700 feet below sea level. It is surrounded almost 360 degrees by mountains. The average height of the mountains is 2,300 feet above sea level, so that's a difference of 3,000 feet. The tallest of those mountains is about 3,500 feet. So you're 700 feet below sea level, you're surrounded by mountains that are at least 2,300 feet above that, so they're 3,000 feet above you. And so you can understand how when you're on the Sea of Galilee, you can't see when storms are coming. Now, add to that, it's later in the evening and probably getting dark, so was it storming when they went out into the water? Probably not. But they get out into the water, and they're in a storm, so much so that in the 7.5 hours that they've been rowing, they've made it 4 miles. And they're now in the deepest part of the sea. Jewish legend tells a story about mythical sea monsters. One particular Jewish legend calls a sea monster Leviathan. And they had a legend that this sea monster, Leviathan, probably controlled by the devil, would frighten sailors out on the sea. And so all of that is some context to what's going on here at the fourth watch of the night. Now, this is not the first time Jesus sent them out into the sea in a storm. We saw it in Matthew chapter 8 when the disciples were out in a boat in the Sea of Galilee and Jesus was down below sleeping. You remember that? They're out in a storm and they're rowing, they're bailing water, and somebody goes down and wakes up Jesus. What are you doing? It's storming out here. Come help us bail water, or whatever they said to him. And remember what happened? Jesus rebuked the wind and the waves, and they were calm. And the disciples said, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obeys him?" Well, that was in Matthew chapter 8. So they've been out on this sea before in a storm, but now this one's different because Jesus sent them into the storm without him. And in the meantime, Jesus has gone up to a mountain, one of those mountains surrounding the Sea of Galilee. So, ostensibly, they can't see Jesus, but Jesus might could see them. I had that thought this week. I just never thunk that before. I'm just envisioning, now Jesus is praying, and I don't think Jesus is praying with one eye open, but Jesus is there alone with the Father, and I wonder if wherever he situated himself on the mountainside, if he's looking down and he's watching the disciples out on the water, so he's watching them in the storm. They're out on the sea, and they're rowing, and they are not making much progress. And verse 25 says, "In the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea." Mark has an interesting thought that I want you to just reference. So keep your finger here in Matthew 14 and turn to Mark 6. Okay? So all right, go to Mark 6, and I want you to look at verse 48. Because Mark adds something that means something in this context, okay? Mark 6:48, he's going to say something very similar. Verse 47, it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and Jesus was alone on the land. Seeing them, straining at the oar. That's where I'm getting this vision, right? So wherever Jesus was on the mountain, he's seeing them, okay? So seeing them straining at the oar because the wind was against them, about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the water. Now here's the part I want you to look at. And he intended to pass them by. That's a fascinating thought. It's storming. It's 4:30 in the morning, and Jesus is just walking by, and he has every intention of just walking by. How you guys doing? I'll meet you over there. And he's just passing by, and I left that with just this weird thought. I hope I'm never so caught up in the midst of the storm that I miss Jesus passing by closely. He would have passed them by. He intended to pass them by and would have had they not called out to him. So now I'm back in Matthew 14. Jesus came to them, verse 25. It's the fourth watch of the night. He came by and he is walking on the sea. All right, so just put yourself in their shoes. All right, it's 4:30 in the morning, so it's dark. You're in the middle of a storm, so what little you can see is just the waves that are crashing around you. You are now tired because you have been rowing for 7.5 hours. And so you squint and see something coming this way on top of the water. What would you think? You're tired. It's the middle of the night. You're a little frustrated, and it's dangerous. And you see a vision, a person on the water, and you know the laws of buoyancy suggest that people don't walk on the water. And so they made what was for them a more logical conclusion. It must be a ghost. So they see Jesus walking on the water, and they were obviously terrified, more terrified now than apparently they were rowing in the storm. So they're rowing in the storm. Now they see this individual walking towards them in the water. Now they're terrified, and they said it's a ghost, and they cried out in fear. So Matthew uses two different words there. They were terrified, and they cried out in fear. Now, I was remembering Job's friend Eliphaz. You remember Job had three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Eliphaz, the oldest one. And when Eliphaz talks, he talks about his personal experiences. And in Job chapter 4, Eliphaz is recounting a dream. And it was apparently a nightmare. And when Eliphaz is talking about it in Job chapter 4, he talks about this dream that he had that made him so afraid, his bones began to shake, and the hair on his head began to stand up. That's what's going on here with the disciples. Okay? They are not only terrified, they are now in fear. And so they cry out. I don't know who they're crying out to. The text doesn't say. I suspect they're crying out to the Lord. But they cry out. And it's on the basis of their cry, Jesus responds. Look at verse 27. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them. Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid. That phrase, it is I, is a phrase that we see more commonly in the Gospel of John. It is literally from the Greek, I am. So when Jesus says, I'm the bread of life, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the door, I am, which is very obviously a play on the name of God from the Old Testament, where back in Exodus chapter 3, Moses says to God, who shall I say sent me to them? And God said, you just tell them I am sent you to them. Okay? That's what Jesus is saying. Take courage. I am. Don't be afraid. All right. Now, that's where the fun begins. So we get through verse 27, and it's still the fourth watch of the night. They are still 4 miles into the Sea of Galilee. It is still storming. There is an individual who has now identified himself as Jesus. Okay? That's all they know. And that individual said, I am Don't be afraid. To which, now verse 28, Peter responds, if it is you. Now, scholars have all kinds of fun with that phrase. Uh, some commentators will suggest, well, that word if in the Greek can mean since it is you. And that's true. That is a relevant, that would be an appropriate rendering of that Greek word. I tend to see it as really more of a validation. If it really is you, because it's still 4:30 in the morning, and I'm still reconciling the fact that Jesus is walking on the water. If it is you, Jesus, then command me. That's an interesting phrase that Peter says. I want you to command me to come out and walk on the water. That sounds very Peter-like, doesn't it? If that's you, then I want you to command me to come out there with you. This is not like John 21 when they're out fishing and Peter saw Jesus and he jumped in the water and swam to him. This is not that. He's still in the boat. He's saying, if it really is you, then you command me to come out and walk on the water. I wonder if maybe Peter spoke before he thought. Maybe Peter's thinking, there's no way Jesus is actually going to ask me to come out there onto the water. But since I'm surrounded by all the other disciples here, I'm just going to presume that I would have gotten out of the boat had you asked me. And so he then says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come. Or maybe Peter's just courageous enough that he really wants to do it. But whatever it is, if it is you, command me to come out and walk on the water. Okay, so Jesus said, come. Did you see that? It's one word. It's in the imperative, so it is a command. Peter said, command me. Come out and walk on the water. And so Jesus obliged. He commanded him, come. All kinds of fun with that word as you track it throughout the New Testament. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden. You see it in Isaiah. Come, all who are thirsty. Come. So, now verse 29. Jesus has issued the command, and Peter is now facing a moment. Okay, the water's not the test. The first step is the test. The test is getting out of the boat. The test is, am I willing to leave whatever is the relative security of this boat and get out and walk on the water just because Jesus said it? So faith is not just believing that I can do something extraordinary. It's believing in the one who told me to do it. So Peter knows to himself, I have no ability to walk on the water. But he has so much confidence in the one who just issued the command, come. The test is not, can I walk on the water? The test is, do I believe what Jesus said? So Jesus said, come. Peter got out of the boat. Okay, so I paused there because I'm leaving room to congratulate Peter. He got out of the boat. None of the others did. Peter got out of the boat, and look what he did. He walked on the water. And for a minute, in the storm, in the middle of the night, there are now two people who are violating the laws of gravity and buoyancy walking on the water. I don't know how many steps that he took. He walked on the water. Matthew didn't just say he took a step. He walked on the water. I don't know why when Peter's writing his letters to the church, Peter didn't reference that. I probably would have. Remember that time when I walked on the water? He didn't, but I think I would have. Peter got out of the boat and he walked on the water and in that sense did something that to our knowledge, two people in the history of the universe have done. He got out of the boat and he walked on the water. His faith will waver, but for a minute, he stood on the waves. So Peter got out of the boat and he's walking on the water and he came towards Jesus. So Jesus apparently stopped wherever Jesus was in proximity to the boat, far enough that they couldn't quite tell who it was, but close enough that they could hear him through the storm. And so Peter gets out of the boat and he starts stepping on the water, moving towards Jesus, and everything's good until verse 30. He saw the wind. Now just stop there, because wind's invisible. You don't see wind. You see the results of wind, right? So he didn't see the wind blowing. It's 4:30 and wind's invisible anyway. What you saw was the waves crashing. What he saw was the results of the wind. And so for however many steps Peter's taking, you can imagine he gets out of the boat. He's looking at Jesus, and he starts taking some steps, and somewhere along the way in that journey from the boat to Jesus, Peter came to the realization, this doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't know how far he was from the boat, but all of a sudden, his focus shifted. Did you see that? He was looking at Jesus, now he's looking at the waves. And from the time that Peter took his focus off of Jesus, he saw the wind, and he became frightened. Okay, this is the third time he's been frightened. He became frightened, and Peter began to sink. So Peter's perception changed. Writer of Hebrews talks about running the race set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Somewhere along the way, Peter took his eyes off Jesus, and he began to sink. There's all kinds of ways we could run with that, allegorically or metaphorically. You know, stuff sinks when you stop looking at Jesus. There's probably a pretty good application there. That is what happened to Peter. In that moment when Peter took his eyes off Jesus, Peter's faith was replaced with fear. Peter's obedience was replaced with reason that would suggest humans don't walk on the water. And I'm in a storm. And so Peter naturally then began to sink. I don't know how far or how quickly Peter began to sink. I know how quickly I would sink if I stepped out of the water into the middle of the sea, but I haven't walked on water, so I don't know if he's slowly sinking like it's in quicksand or if he's just going all the way under. But Peter began to sink. It's at least enough time where his head's above water to cry out. So however much time it took for him to be standing on the waves to when he is fully submerged by them, he has enough time to cry out. And so Peter was afraid, naturally he was, and now Peter calls out. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, we walk by faith and not by sight. Because what Peter saw defied what Jesus said. So Peter saw the winds and the waves, and he then naturally began to sink, and he cried out, Lord, save me. And now you see the word again, immediately. Jesus reached out his hand. So did Jesus run over to him? Did he dig him out of the water, however deep Peter was? The text doesn't say. Jesus just reached out his hand immediately. Whatever distance was there previously between Peter and Jesus is now bridged by Jesus reaching. Jesus reached out his hand, and immediately he took hold of him. Peter cried out passionate prayer, Lord, save me. Maybe the most passionate prayer Peter ever prayed. Not the longest prayer Peter prayed. This was not the time for a long prayer. There's nothing wrong with long prayers. He doesn't have enough time for a long prayer. He's got just enough time to say 3 words. Jesus, save me. I've wondered sometimes when I'm at a hospital and I'm talking with someone who maybe they're on a ventilator, or maybe they're in a state of semi-consciousness, and maybe they're that close to seeing Jesus. And I've wondered, is there a moment in the last moments of earthly perception where they pray something like that, Lord, save me? And Peter cries out in what would have been his last moments, Lord, save me. And we recognize that the sincerity of our prayers is not judged by the number of words that we use. Lord, save me. And Jesus immediately reached out his hand. And now there's an interesting interchange that takes place before they get back to the boat. Hey, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and he took hold of him. Okay, I'm going to build on a thought because there's something missing that my mind wants to know. Jesus reached out his hand and now he's holding Peter and said, "You of little faith." Now remember, he's the guy that just got out of the boat, walked on the water. And Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith." Matthew uses that phrase a number of times in Matthew's gospel, where Jesus at certain points throughout his earthly ministry encountering the disciples and says something similar to them, "Oh, you of little faith." Matthew 6, they were worried about provisions, and Jesus told a story about the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the flowers of the field and said, "Oh, you of little faith." Matthew 8, when there's a storm and Jesus is asleep at the bottom of the boat, calms the storm, "Oh, you of little faith." Matthew 16, Jesus said, "Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees." And the disciples thought Jesus was talking about the food because he just fed the 5,000 and fed the 4,000. And Jesus said, "Oh, you of little faith. Why did you doubt?" Now, verse 32 says, when they got to the boat. That's the part that's missing. So I've wondered, wherever they were, however distant they were from the boat, however many steps Peter took from the boat to Jesus before he sank, Jesus reached out his hand, picked him up. Okay, I don't know how far that distance is. Jesus grabbed his hand, he's holding him. But I'm just wondering the question, how did they get back to the boat? Because there's really only about 3 options, right? Option 1, Jesus carried him. Okay? Option 2, they swam, which doesn't seem to be the case because Jesus is holding him. Or option 3, Jesus is holding Peter's hand and they walk back to the boat. I don't know. The text doesn't say. It just says when they got to the boat, which suggests that there was some kind of transition from where they were to the time when they got back. I don't know what they did, but I just pictured Jesus holding his hand. This is what you would have done if you'd have stayed watching me. And they're walking their way back to the boat. So when they get back to the boat, Jesus continues his lecture. He had just said, "Why did you doubt?" And they make it back to the boat, and the wind stops. No rebuking of the wind and the waves here, just presence of Jesus in the boat, and the wind stopped. So again, the winds and the seas have obeyed him, now even anticipating his command. The winds stopped. Verse 33 says, everybody in the boat worshiped him. Here's the point of the story. So the story is about more than Peter walked on the water or Jesus walked on the water or they're out 4 miles into the water. Did Jesus walk 4 miles from the shore to the water, or did he just appear? Text doesn't say. He's out there in the middle of the sea with them, 4 miles into the sea, with 4 miles still across, and there's a moment now. They're back in the boat. The wind stopped. I don't know what time it is, but by the time they get to shore, it's daylight because the rest of the chapter says the people there that were on the other side recognized them. So however much time now it takes till we get to shore, there's either some kind of Bible study or worship service there in the middle of the sea, or it takes that much time to travel the other 4 miles. They're in the boat now, and they're worshiping. Now I think we begin to get the perspective. Why is Matthew telling us this story? Is it just to say how cool it was that Peter walked on the water? No, there's more to that. Is it just to say that Jesus can calm the storms? Well, he can, but there's more than that, because watch what the text says. Those who were with him in the boat worshiped him and said, "Truly you are God's Son." Now, this is before Matthew 16, where Jesus said to the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they began speculating. Some say the prophet, some say Elijah, some say John. And Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" Peter spoke. "You are the Christ, Son of the living God." This is before that. So between here and Matthew 16, there's a little bit more maturity in Peter's theology, but here there is an exclamation that seems to identify something that they were already thinking through. You really are God's Son. You really are who you say you are. And there's a moment in the boat when Peter's theology is stretched. So Peter didn't start sinking because the storms were taller than he was. He started sinking because he gave more attention to the waves than he did to the one who was speaking. So Jesus says, "Come." Peter got out of the boat. He walks on the water. He sees the winds and the waves. He begins to sink, cries out to Jesus, comes back to the boat, and they worship. So Matthew's not telling us this story to say, look what Peter did. He's telling us this story to say, look who Jesus is. That's the point of the story. That's what we get when we get to this point of the story. We're in a progressive learning stage where we're learning something more about Jesus, about who this is, about what he says, because in all probability, we're not going to be rowing a boat in the Sea of Galilee in the middle of the night with Jesus walking on the water. Very likely that's not going to happen. On the other hand, there are very likely going to be times in your life when you are in a storm. Peter's was literal. Yours might be metaphorical, but you're going to be in the middle of a storm, and here's what you need to know. However deep waters you are in, or however bad the storm is that you are facing, number one, you are never very far from where Jesus is. If you miss him, he may pass by, but he's probably right there close. And it might be that he wants to do something in the storm. He wants you to learn something in the storm that you would not have learned in the calm. He wants you to know that he's Lord of the storm. It's not that he can cause you to do great things, and maybe God will do that. And even the question is not so much, are you willing to get out of the boat? The question is, do you know who's standing in the water? That's the picture that Matthew's giving. It's not about Peter. It's not about Peter walking on the water. It's about the one standing there who's calling him. That's the lesson that we take. Sometimes God allows lessons in our lives that are only learned in storms. Sometimes we learn that in the presence of whatever storms we're facing more pressingly than we would learn in the calm. So faith is learning not just to trust the word of the Lord, but to trust the one who said it. I trust him. What he said may not make sense, but I hear that he's called, and the only way I'm going to walk on the water is to get out of the boat, and I'm going because he said it. And all of a sudden, in this storm, we hear his voice. Danger comes when I take my eyes off of him. When I lose focus, when I take my eyes off of Jesus and I begin looking at the sea. You've done that. I've done that. Whatever storm you're facing, and all of a sudden, all you can see is how bad the storm is, how bad the health report is, how bad the financial crisis is, how bad the relationship is, how bad the turmoil is. And I'm not making light of whatever storm you're walking through. I'm just reminding us that when you're walking through it, there is somebody walking there with you. And that's the picture of faith. When you are in trouble, cry out to him. And you will discover that the water that was over your head is under his feet. The storm's not bigger than him. And so I cry out to him. And one last thought. When you see him, don't forget he's worthy of worship. Let's pray. God, thank you for the lesson we learned about Peter. Not just the story that we learned about Peter's life, but the story about our faith. And I pray that when you allow us, or when you direct us into the storm, that you teach us something, that our eyes are fixed on you, and we trust you by faith. When we get back to the boat, we'll worship you again as the one who is and has always been worthy. And I pray that in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. Have a good week.